Hello everyone, and welcome to video number 16. We're continuing to dive into Romanticism in Europe. And today we're specifically going to talk about Romanticism as a literary movement. So you'll remember in our last video we discussed how this romantic idea emerged in social and political movements, this idea of everyone having this common quality of human dignity, and how that led to a number of revolutions and uprisings. And today we're going to see how that same concept of human dignity and focus on the individual appeared throughout literature during this time period. So we're going to have three main objectives for today's video, and the first is to identify the key characteristics of Romantic writing. So by the end of this video, I should then be able to look at key examples of literature and be able to identify whether or not they share those characteristics of Romantic writing. The second thing we're going to be able to do is to compare the values of Romantic writers, which is the focus for our unit, at least this first half, and comparing it then with neoclassical writers. So looking at the difference in terms of literary movements and how they evolved over time. And then finally, getting a clearer understanding of what Romanticism looks like in literature by looking at key studies from Germany, England, and France. In all of today's video, we're going to be focusing specifically in your textbook on page 878 and page 879. If you don't have your textbooks, not to worry. I'm going to go in depth, so you really won't need it in front of you. It's only if you have it and if you would like. So the first thing that we need to do is really understand Romanticism as a literary movement. We're going to ask ourselves this question: what is Romanticism when we talk about it in terms of literature? So it's this artistic and intellectual movement that takes place during the late 18th to mid-19th century. So think the late 1700s to the middle of the 1800s. And it has this huge impact on artistic expression. And that simply means how artists choose to express themselves. And we see this clear movement away from strict and rigid artistic expression, so needing to follow form and needing to follow certain guidelines, and more of writing however you want and expressing yourself with freedom, no limitations. And we see that this still exists today. And we also understand that it has certain unique characteristics that go along with this movement away from following form and following rules. In this embracing of being able to write however you like, we have this expression of intense emotion that goes on. So not restricting the way in which we express what we're feeling in order to abide by social or cultural norms. So what society or culture thinks is appropriate. And by extension, you have this intense interest in nature and the world around us. So looking at the mountains that we see and the nature and expressing it intensely, not holding back for fear that it might be perceived in a wrong way by society or afraid of what society will think of this expression. And this also extends into individual experience and the imagination. And the key text that we're going to be reading together to discuss Romanticism, again, is the literary masterpiece by Johann von Goethe called Faust. And in this, we are going to see a lot of emphasis not only on the imagination, so bringing in aspects of the supernatural, but looking at individual experience and human nature in terms of giving away or striving to pursue knowledge and seek knowledge at any cost. Now then that we have this firm understanding of Romanticism, this idea that it's an embracing of human experience and intense emotional expression and connection with nature, we're going to then compare that to the literary movement that came before it, Neoclassicism. And we're going to see that Romanticism is this revolt against everything that Neoclassicism stood for. So I'm sure many of you are wondering, what on earth is Neoclassicism? So very simply, it's the literary movement that occurred just before Romanticism. So very much in the 18th century or the 1700s. and they valued reason and form and order. So you can align this with the social political movement of the Enlightenment. And because they value reason and form and order, you're going to see that they have a very specific writing style. And this emerges not only in tightly controlled poetry. So think, for example, back to Shakespearean sonnets, how they have a specific rhyme scheme and a specific meter, and that you're not allowed to deviate away from any of these. They also rely heavily on this expression of wit. So, for example, for those who are familiar with Voltaire and his satirical work Candide, so this idea of attacking certain things within society, but doing so from a very highly intellectual space, and also one that at the same time is very sarcastic and witty. And we're going to see that Romanticism is going to react completely to this rigid focus on reason and form and order. And just one brief example, because I have mentioned it before in class, John Milton's Paradise Lost, this extension, if you will, of Dante's ideas of these different levels of hell, but focusing then on the precursor to this, and Milton's expression of the rebellion that occurred between Lucifer and God, and focusing on how that impacted Lucifer in his side of the story, right? But in the same time that he's focusing on these religious ideas and bringing in his own imagination, this is a great example of neoclassic writing because it's very tightly controlled in the way that it's written, and it sticks rigidly to form. And we're going to see in our Romantic literature that this rigidness is completely abandoned and embracing more of a free-flowing style of writing. Before we move away then from comparing these two literary movements and getting in depth into what Romanticism looked like in Europe, I just want to talk about some key aspects of Neoclassicism and Romanticism in terms of comparing them. Again, you'll find this table on page 878 of your textbooks, and I've copied it verbatim here for you. But when we think about neoclassical versus Romantic writers, they are the opposite of one another. So for example, in this first bullet point, we see that neoclassical writers stressed reason and intellect. So they would have written about things that were highly logical and were very much reflective of things going on in society as a whole. Whereas Romantic writers would have stressed then emotions and imagination. So moving away from form and structure and reason into looking inside of humanity and looking at the emotions that make us tick. Again, you'll see that expressed in what they chose to write about as well. You'll see in that second bullet point that neoclassical writers then would have written about objective issues, so things that would have been important or concerning all of society, whereas Romantic writers looked away from society and instead were very subjective in terms of looking at individual human experience. And again, we see this reflected also in their respect of certain institutions in the way that they wrote. So neoclassical writers, although they would have been concerned about certain issues in society, they held high respect for certain man-made institutions of the church and of state or government. Whereas Romantic writers, we know, appreciated nature and creativity and the destructive forces that existed there. Again, emphasizing, if you had to put just one word on the difference between these two, neoclassical writers were obsessed with order and looking at the way that order is perceived in everything, whereas Romantic writers believed in spontaneity in thought and action. So this idea of going with your urges, so doing what you feel rather than maintaining order and form. And you see this as well in that bullet point number 5, then, how they look at certain social and cultural standards. So while neoclassical writers very much maintained and upheld traditional standards in society, we turn to Romantic writers and see that they believe very much in experimentation. So it's not wrong to go against the flow of society and try to experiment with not only how you write, but what you write about. Again, turning back to their topic for discussion, neoclassical writers were very concerned with focusing on things about the upper class or the ruling class, so those adult concerns. So not looking so much and concerning themselves with the common man. And we see that Romantic writers then look at this void in literature, this lack of focus on the experiences of childhood or the common man, and this is what they then choose to write about. And then look, finally, those last 2 points. Neoclassical writers, as we already said, looked for controlled emotion. So yes, attacking things in society they saw as wrong, but doing so from a very witty and satirical stance, which takes a lot of control in order to do well. Whereas Romantic writers celebrate intense passion and vision, so not having to control or rein in their emotions. And then finally, again, we see neoclassical writers very much followed formal rules and dictions, particularly in terms of their poetry. Whereas when we come to Romantic writers, we see that they seek a more natural poetic form and diction. So not having to follow all of those rules and be rigid in terms of their structure, but writing in a way where they express exactly what they're feeling. Diving then into our last objective for today, dissecting those Romantic movements in Germany, England, and France. And we're going to begin with Germany first. And Romanticism in Germany develops as a series of separate movements. So it's not something that occurs entirely in the country all at once, but it's more of this trickling effect. And we also see that Germany is the first country really to embrace Romanticism, and they do so in this movement of Sturm und Drang, and this is just translated as storm and stress. So storm giving this image of intensity, and stress, right, again, focusing on human emotion, originality. So we see that they're not only going to glorify individual human experience in their writing, but also looking at nature and the world around them. And the key author that we see emerge in German Romanticism is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And he is not only the author who we're going to study in depth for Romanticism, but he really is the one who authors this idea of the romantic hero. So one of those archetypes in literature of that dark and brooding main character who rejects the norms of society and really stands out as this black sheep. And we see that this emerges in his novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther. And I've included a picture of the cover on your right. This is available, by the way, online for free for those of you who would like to read it. It's wonderful, and it talks about this man from an aristocratic family who's destined to become a lawyer, but he rejects what society wants for him in order to pursue what he wants for his life. And also we see, not only through Goethe, but through other German writers, this emphasis on folklore, so meaning traditional cultural tales, and also the supernatural. This is a huge element we're going to see in our reading of Faust, our emphasis for Romantic literature in this unit. The next area we're going to go to is England, and English Romanticism, as we know from our previous video, really begins with this publication of lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge, two incredibly creative but also famous English poets from this time period. We also have a number of other poetic powerhouses like William Blake, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and John Keats, and they all have this focus on intense human emotion and the celebration of nature and the world around them. And rather than choosing diction or language that celebrates the upper class and sort of highlights their life, we see these poets turning to language and subjects then of the common man and common life. In particular, using nature to help stimulate these ideas and reflect on the relationship that exists between reality, so the real life that we live, and this ideal, this picturesque life that we want. And that's something else we're going to see when we look at Romanticism. It's taking this picture and really putting this filter on it that brightens it and makes it more romantic, more poetic. Then finally, we come to French Romanticism. This is the last of the three to emerge, even though, as we said in our last video, on a social and political level, this movement emerges first in France, but it takes a while for the literature really to catch up with that. And we do see that French Romantic literature is heavily influenced by the French Revolution. So this cry of not just for a new society, but for a new type of literature. And again, that would be literature that doesn't focus on looking at the upper class and promoting their needs and their ideals, but looking at the common man. And we see this exemplified beautifully in Victor Hugo's writing. So he wrote very personal and highly emotional literature, and he completely turns away from those rules of Neoclassicism. Remember, needing to follow form and being very rigid. And two beautiful examples of this are The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Les Miserables. Again, both of these available online for free for those who would like to read them. And they beautifully exemplify these characteristics of Romanticism and turning towards the sort of struggles of the common man. And then finally, before we finish up today's video, I want to emphasize a few strategies for reading that are going to help you better understand and approach the romantic examples of literature that we'll be reading together. And the first is to notice how romantic writers embrace certain huge topics such as life, death, love, and nature. So as you read, knowing that one, if not more, of these subjects are going to be put on display. Additionally, number two, when we get to talking about poetry, needing not just to understand what is being said, but how it's being said. So what sound devices are used, and how do those sound devices help create a specific mood and atmosphere that links to Romanticism. Again, we need to pay attention to the use of imagery and figurative language. So we're not sort of tearing away the image being created in the inner depth of what's being said. Remember, Romanticism is all about this intense expression of emotion, and one of the main ways that we use to express this intensity is figurative language. Additionally, we're going to watch out for elements of the exotic or the supernatural. We're going to see that specifically when we begin reading Faust. So thinking about why do we see certain aspects of the supernatural appearing in this literature, and what is the purpose for that? Why this removal from reality and then focusing on sort of what's behind the veil, so to speak. And then finally, we need to remember that we're not forgetting those active reading skills that we learned about in the very beginning of the year. So as I'm reading, I need to be able to predict what might be coming next. Visualize what is being told to me. If I wanted to make a movie of this story, what would it look like? Again, connecting to the literature. So although there are supernatural elements, are there aspects of the story that I can link to on a personal level? Asking myself questions for clarification. So first of all, comprehension-wise, what's happening? But also analytically, why is the author choosing to turn the story in the way that they do? And then finally, evaluating what I'm reading. So placing judgment on the text and the story being told. That's it for today's video. In our next video, we're going to look more in depth into our author for Romanticism, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and looking specifically at the background for his story Faust. So what sort of tales were going on in German society at the time that influenced Goethe to write this extensive play, in essence, about this intellectual man who makes a deal with the devil. And then finally, our literary analysis focus, which is going to be looking at dialogue. So what characters say, but also importantly, what they do not say, and how I can use this aspect of dialogue to really help clarify meaning in terms of what is going on in the broader story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.